Well, I was, you bring it up in the book on more than one occasion, and then there's a passage, and forgive me if I'm misremembering, but I think it's closer to the end of the book where you kind of talk about your upbringing and your education
Hmm.
in Minnesota as a kid and how it sort of set the stage for your pursuits in later life and maybe some of your politics and social consciousness and all that kind of stuff. And I was very impressed by it. I was very impressed
Mm.
by the education that you received as a kid in Minneapolis. I was
Yeah.
I, I was raised in Milwaukee. I'm a bit older than you are,
Oh.
but I'm also from the upper Midwest and public school kid from like suburban Milwaukee. And so very fond memories of it, but I left before I got to high school. And so I didn't get like the high school, like really, formal education stuff that you are referring to. But you just talk a little bit about your upbringing in Minnesota and in particular that part of it, how it sort of like laid a foundation for you.
Yeah. Yeah, I was born in Allentown, actually, Allentown, Pennsylvania, but we moved to Minnesota when I was 3. My dad got a job working as an editor at the Star Tribune at the newspaper there. And and yeah, Minneapolis, I think everybody that grows up there probably has the sense it's very progressive place. You know, when you look at our politicians, the politicians that have come out of Minneapolis, they tend to be some of the most progressive in the country. And I think it kind of goes counter to a common idea of what Midwestern politics are, that they're kind of folksy or kind of a little centrist. And it wasn't really until I moved to the East Coast. When you grow up, I'm sure this is true for you, maybe when you grow up in the Midwest and then you move to a coast, you go to the coast with a sense like, oh, I'm from a really backward place. I need to I need to learn how to be more sophisticated politically and socially and culturally. And it kind of took 20 years before of living on the East Coast, mostly a little bit on the West Coast, before I kind of realized that I had grown up in one of the most radical places in the country. And when the summer of 2020 happened and George Floyd was murdered by the police and the response in Minneapolis was as dramatic as it was, it made a lot of sense to me that that uprising started there. It seemed, maybe it was just because I was from there, but it just seemed natural to me that something so radical would happen there.
What are the roots? Is it Scandinavian roots? Is that what it is that has a place like Minnesota, like being so blue and having, especially Minneapolis, having these really progressive roots?
Yeah, there's for sure, yeah, a lot of Scandinavians settled in Minnesota. You know, in Minneapolis, the American Indian movement started there. There's a big, sizable population of indigenous people who've always been very active. And for example, in my high school, there was a magnet program for kids of indigenous descent where they taught history from a Native American perspective and things like that. There was an Ojibwe drum and dance team at the school. Um, there's, a really active and, there's always been, or at least when I was growing up there, a pretty vocal community of kind of Black radical politics too. Keith Ellison, came out of, he's from Michigan and originally, but his political career developed in Minnesota, and there was a radio station that we all would listen to called KMOJ that was like a Black community radio station that had a lot of political discussions and just kind of really I felt like in Minnesota you were exposed to a number of radical political traditions without kind of that were just kind of present, on the airwaves. Your school bus driver would be playing it, or one of your teachers would be um, running an event or inviting guests to class. It just felt pretty common. There was a big punk scene in the 80s and 90s there that was still very present when I was in high school. Um, all of those strands were kind of just around me growing up.
And you were impressionable. Like, I don't know if every kid registered it maybe as much as you did.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing about people from Minneapolis is they tend to be really earnest, and sometimes that's really annoying. I don't know if that's true from Milwaukee too. There's like an earnestness and a seriousness. And so I definitely have, I probably take everything a little bit too seriously, and I'm probably a little too earnest in that way. And I think, yeah, I was always yeah, pretty sensitive to some of this stuff, and the discussions around, I don't know, revising, rewriting historical narratives that were taking place in the 90s. That I was just really interested in all of that at the time.
And you mentioned your dad was a editor at the Star Tribune. You were sort of following in his footsteps as a journalist.
Yeah, so he worked at the Star Tribune when I was really little, and then in the early 1990s became editor of Minnesota Monthly, a regional, just like a regional magazine that was owned by Minnesota Public Radio. And eventually he went to work at Minnesota Public Radio. But yeah, so we had magazine writers, around the house sometimes. I was always hearing him talk about the writers he's working with, and assigning pieces to, and the photographers he'd hired to do features, and we also just subscribed to every magazine out there at the time. So there were just tons of magazines around the house, and yeah, so just nonfiction writing was always just something. It was just like there on the table. And so as I was reading it, or whatever my dad was reading, which at the time my dad was probably reading a lot of like these kind of nonfiction adventure books. I feel like kind of Sebastian Junger, and John Krakauer, and Norman MacLean, and yeah, so I would read those because they were lying around, and that was kind of the tradition I was first exposed to, and then later kind of got interested in the new journalism.
And so you leave Minneapolis and go east for college at, what was it, Brown?
Mm-hmm.
To have the trajectory right. So you go to Brown. Do you study journalism there?
No, they didn't have journalism. There was also a little interlude. I was an exchange student in high school. I lived in Chile for a year, from the middle of my junior year to the middle of my senior year, and then I went to college. Um, yeah, they didn't have a journalism program. They had a department called Modern Culture and Media, and they had a major that was called Art Semiotics, that was kind of partially visual art and partially, yeah, modern culture and media, which was, all the French media theorists and philosophers like Baudrillard and Derrida and Foucault. And I was just really immediately drawn towards that department, and that's what I ended up studying, along with Portuguese and Brazilian studies.
Okay. And so then going, you're like very well educated person based on your like CV. You went from Brown, I think, did you go to Columbia? You went to Oxford or something like Cambridge?
There were some years in between, yeah. So after college, I moved to New York. It didn't really go that well. Um, and then a friend was living down in Little Rock, Arkansas, and working at the Oxford American, at that Southern Literary magazine. So he was like, "Come down here. There's a room. It's $200 a month. It's like Sex in the City of the Ozarks."
Hey,
So
you're really selling it.
yeah, so I went down there for a year, and then I got a job at an alt weekly in Miami. I was there for a couple of years. So I had some journalism experience. And then, yeah, then I got a Fulbright. I went to Africa for a year, to Mozambique. And then I went back to grad school. So I was kind of like in my mid to late 20s. I went to journalism school, which I probably didn't need to have done. And then I graduated in 2009, and there's nothing, there's no work. And I'd applied to a fellowship at Cambridge, which I didn't get, but I did get a decent scholarship there. So I just took out another loan and went to grad school again. But both of those were just 1-year programs.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So Mozambique, what did you do there? I know you're on a Fulbright. You're doing some sort of research or?
Yeah, so you propose a project for a Fulbright, and I basically tried to do an oral history of this film school they had there after Mozambique became independent from Portugal in the mid 70s, and it was this kind of experimental. Mozambique had a socialist government at the time, and so all of these filmmakers, like this Brazilian filmmaker Rui Guerra and Jean-Luc Godard and another French filmmaker named Jean Rouch, they came down to Mozambique and taught classes, and the film school produced this weekly newsreel called Kusha Kanema and a number of documentaries, some of which were very propagandistic, but they were also very, very beautifully shot. And all of this film stock was kind of moldering in an archive in Maputo. So, and there was a lot of politics about trying to save that archive because the government was no longer socialist, and yeah, it was maybe trying to forget some of that past. So I just kind of did oral histories with everybody I could find who'd been involved in the program, and stored them in the archive there. And I wrote a piece about it for N+1, but that was kind of all that came out of it.
So loosely journalistic, though, like the stuff that you were doing there.
Yeah, because I'd already worked as a reporter at the New Times in Miami, so I was already gravitating toward journalism.
Why?
I don't know. Honestly, I think it was because I grew up around it, and writing was the only thing anybody ever told me I was good at. So
Same,
you just
right?
keep doing it, right?
Hey, like
And
I think we have the Midwestern earnestness. I often make this joke where I'm like, listen, if you tell me I'm good at something, I'm gonna believe you. Like
yeah.
I'm looking for somebody to tell me.
Yeah, and there was a minute there where I thought about applying to law school and or doing a PhD in English, but nothing really worked out. I just kind of, even when I was doing other things, I was always writing and publishing and pitching articles just because I'd kind of grown up, yeah, maybe knowing how to do that. So, or thinking that any experience you had could be turned into an article, and not like you would make a lot of money, but you maybe would make a little bit of money, or at least get published. So
How do you pitch an article? I know this is probably a longer conversation than we're going to have, but are there any like simple hints you can give people if like I wanted to write about something happening here in Los Angeles and I wanted to go to the LA Times or to some magazine and pitch an article? What do you do?
it's really hard to break in. I mean, I don't even know now, but at the time, so for example, I I N+1 started. What year did N+1 start? Maybe like 2004, 2005, something like that. And I was really into N+1. I was reading N+1 and really liking it. Really wanted to write for them. And so I think with the Mozambique piece, it just kind of played into the founding editors. Keith Gesson came from Russia. He definitely had an interest in sort of post, like the failure of Marxist politics, and kind of proxy Cold War encounters. And yeah, so I pitched them, and they took it out of the slush pile. And I think I just kind of, I have no idea how that pitch read, but at the time I wanted to write a sort of third person narrative magazine style story, not really a first person essay, but I think it became more first person as I was working with them.
So when you pitch, like is it like the pitch itself, is it pretty short and then you just like attach the piece? Is that what you do?
I hadn't written the piece, so usually what you do is try to keep it to a page, have a really like compelling, punchy idea. But that's the thing about pitching, is a lot of times I read stories in magazines and I can see, oh, that was probably a really good pitch, but kind of a bad story, because something that's really pitchy and has a hook, sometimes feels forced. And I think I was just lucky with N+1 that they were that, and I think a lot of writers have felt this way about that magazine in particular, that they kind of let you it doesn't need to be all worked out before you start writing the piece. Whereas if you're pitching the New Yorker, it kind of does, or you need to kind of have a really strong sense of what it is that you're doing. I mean, I think the first piece I successfully pitched to the New Yorker was about the founders of the drug website Erowid.
Which I read, by the way.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, years ago. I mean, I was like, oh yeah, I read that one. I don't always like fully lock like who wrote it, you know, when I'm just like reading the magazine or reading online. But kudos, I read that post or that article with interest.
Yeah, I mean, and that was just fun. I mean, I think with that, it was just they'd been around at that point for a long time. There's nothing really like it on the internet. And somehow it interested the New Yorker editors. And at the New Yorker now, so even though if you're a staff writer, you have to pitch regularly. Everybody goes to pitch meetings. You're pitching not even usually for yourself, but for the broader pool of writers. Sometimes you go to specific meetings that are about politics or about culture, so that you kind of get in practice of like kind of summarizing a thing, why you think it's important, maybe who you think should write it.
And you are a staff writer for the New Yorker now.
I am, yeah. I write mostly for the web, so I probably only write 1 or 2 print pieces a year. So it's a little bit of a different identity there than, some of the really big name writers.
No, but still, I mean, I think it's important. And the reason I wanted to start here is to just sort of establish your like scholarly bona fides and your professional trajectory a little bit, because when it comes to your new memoir, Health and Safety, it, I think, tracks a life trajectory that is a little bit in reverse, at least compared to most people. Like most people sort of go nuts in their 20s or at college.
Yeah.
And I don't mean go nuts, but I mean like have like a wild time of some kind, or take risks when it comes to drugs or, I don't know, like going traveling or whatever it might be. And for you, it seems like you went to college, you were very sort of studious and by the book and achieving at a high level and going to great schools and all this stuff, getting a Fulbright. And then when it comes to health and safety, you are documenting a period of your life where you experimented a lot with psychedelics in particular that didn't really begin until you were, 31 years old?
Yeah.
So talk about that, because that, I feel like that is unusual.
Yeah, I think if I had found my way toward it in my 20s, but it was just kind of not around. I would have been interested in it. I was always interested in things and kind of new experiences. I like having most experience. I don't know. But in my 20s, I just had a really hard time finding a social scene. Drugs weren't really around me. In Little Rock, I had a really fun group of friends, but then I moved to Miami, which, it was a fun city, and it was kind of before internet dating. I think internet dating probably would have really changed the experience of that place, but it was hard to meet people, especially people that I had stuff in common with. And, it's just like moving around a lot, and yeah, terrified of just not finding any kind of career, and watching the sidewalk of journalism kind of roll up behind you, and just, I don't know, I didn't really, for most of my 20s, I barely made enough to live off of. I lived with roommates. I just didn't really, I don't know, I was a late bloomer. I couldn't find my place. And then in my early 30s, yeah, I think a little bit out of disappointment, I was drawn towards psychedelic scenes. And I think the broader culture was drawn towards psychedelic scenes at that time. As I write in the book, I was probably just channeling a trend that seemed to be happening.
That's true, right? Like I kind of look back on my own behavior and my own experience, and it felt like a kind of resurgence, because I went to Boulder for college. So you can imagine, like age 18, 19, it was like a lot of psychedelics and a lot of that. And then there was nothing until this time period in the, what do you call it, the mid-teens or whatever, when I feel like it sort of started to come back. Why do you think that was?
Well, there's a few reasons that I bring up in the book. I mean, one was, they shut down in New York, they shut down a lot of the big clubs they passed this law called the Rave Act that kind of made party promoters liable for any drug use at their parties, and that really dampened the rave scene in North America or in the US. I mean, and a lot of the big events that had been happening in the 90s ended. There was this big acid bust and in Kansas that people argue over whether that was the cause of the so-called acid drought of the early 2000s, but there was a very well documented decline in the availability of LSD. And the number
Breaking
of
the
people,
supply chain.
yeah, the number of people that reported using it, and the Grateful Dead had stopped touring, which had been like a big network of distribution. So yeah, there was just a kind of moment. It just wasn't very psychedelic time, and you see that reflected in the music of the time, which everybody was talking about cough syrup, and then I want to say, yeah, like the late 2000s, there's kind of like MDMA started to get kind of trendy again, but I think it was also that the drugs became available on the internet for a lot of people, on Silk Road, and I think it was partially that. I think there was a kind of revisionism in the stigma that had happened after the 60s, and I don't know, it just kind of, you felt it. There were just all of a sudden people were talking about psychedelics more, and like I write in the book, I went to the Horizons conference in New York in 2013. I think I went for the first time. There were all these ayahuasca circles everywhere, and it just kind of became trendy again. And I'm sure there were people, especially on the West Coast, that were, doing fine through that whole time and taking drugs the whole time, but it really didn't feel like you just really I noticed a change.
Yeah, me too. I
Yeah.
mean, I'm on the West Coast, and I noticed that I'm not exactly the best person to ask. That I'm not like super tuned into the drug scene, but I could feel in the cultural conversation, at least, that people were interested and that people were having these experiences and sort of talking about them, either in writing or podcasts or whatever it is. And so I want to talk with you a little bit about like some of the more powerful early experiences that you had with psychedelics and that you describe in the book. There is the heroic dose of psilocybin mushrooms that you took. And then I think the ayahuasca circle trip that you did. Were those two of the more powerful early psychedelic experiences that you had?
Yeah, I had ayahuasca was my first real prolonged psychedelic experience. Like I had smoked some DMT with friends, and that was my intro. And that's the same active chemicals as you find in ayahuasca. So it gave me like a sense of the visuals, but then yeah, and it was just because it was what was available. Like as soon as I started being interested in this, it was just pretty easy at that time in New York. To go up to the Catskills and find a scene of people that were doing ceremonies on the weekends. And yeah, so I kind of went into that and had a very, very powerful first experience that honestly, I've done ayahuasca maybe 5 or 6 times since then, and it's never quite been matched. And
Can you describe what it was like, what was so powerful about it?
well, it was so all encompassing. It wasn't an enhancement of my surroundings. It was almost like a recession into my own mind where the show was really fully going on. And I guess I was surprised that the hallucination took the form of an entity, and people had said that, but really did take the form of a guide or an entity that was kind of all knowing and loving, and could kind of knew me as I couldn't really know myself, and was there to show me things about myself and the world that, you know, were basically dispensing lessons, you know, and the lesson that I describe in the book was to let go of this kind of critical women's magazine voice, as I put it, that's always like, oh, you need to be doing this to your skin and having this attitude and acting this way to attract men, and it kind of dissolved that.
And just to interrupt, I apologize, but like I've often read, and I think you say even in the book, that the this manifestation of like a being inside of an ayahuasca trip is not something unique to you. This is something many people who take ayahuasca report, and they often report that the entity is female.
Yeah, that's in, you know, she's traditionally referred to as abuela or grandmother. And yeah, I mean, there's very common tropes. People tend to see the same visuals and the same, they tend to see dragons or serpents, or sorry, not dragons, jaguars.
I was like,
I
I'm
didn't,
going to go do some ayahuasca. This
yeah, so there are really common commonalities to it, and the people that lead these ceremonies kind of ideally know very well how the plant can work inside of people in all the different ways. But I've had very, you know, my experience with it has been really varied, and at other times it's been pretty dark, actually.
like even with abuela can be dark.
Yeah, abuela will show you things that you might not want to know, or that, you know, I don't write about it in the book, but I did do ayahuasca almost immediately after my breakup, hoping that I would go into the experience and get some kind of solace or comfort. And the counsel that I got, such as it were, was just, there's no redeeming quality to this experience. It's just cruelty. There's nothing, there's no story to it. There's no explanation to it, which was really a painful, you know, I thought I could go do ayahuasca and it would be kind of like all revealed to me why it had happened. And then it was just this kind of void, which ultimately, you know, was correct. I mean, there was no, there's nothing to really learn from all of what had happened. And yeah, it wasn't like some kind of really negative experience. It was just telling, that was the lesson of that particular ayahuasca trip, and it wasn't wrong.
Right. Yeah.
Even if I wanted to hear something else.
I've had similar experiences. Like I think sometimes going into a psychedelic trip, it can be tempting to want to get a kind of clean and easy answer to some like vexing problem that you have, like personally or professionally. Occasionally I'll hear about people who have some like really like epiphanic moment in the middle of a trip that really helps them make some kind of creative breakthrough. Those are the stories you hang on to. But I've had experiences where I kind of went into a trip hoping to get an answer, and the answer was basically like, there are no shortcuts. And then you're like, oh, right. Okay.
Yep.
glad I spent like 6 hours, you know, like in a like laser tunnel waiting for that one to come to me. But it's not wrong, right? It's not wrong.
Yeah, exactly.
So this book is called Health and Safety, and the subtitle is A Breakdown. And you mentioned very briefly at the top of the conversation that this is kind of a sad story.
Mm-hmm.
It's a story about a breakup. You just talked about it with respect to doing ayahuasca that other time, like after the breakup. And if I may, I think like the book is framed around two relationships, one primarily, but there was a guy that you were dating named Matt, at least named Matt in the book, who was with you, I think, as you were sort of first dabbling. And he had a more like spiritual orientation toward drugs and psychedelics, and a more kind of disciplined, less hedonistic, if that's a way of putting it, approach to this stuff. It was kind of, it was part of his spiritual arrangement. And then the other relationship, which is dealt with in greater detail, is the relationship you had with a guy who in the book is called Andrew. And when it comes to the subtitle of your book, A Breakdown, it speaks at least in part to that relationship and to his particular mental health trajectory. So those two relationships and your drug experiences are part of the framework of the book. But then it's also a book that's framed around, I think, in a like more macro sense, the election of Donald Trump in 2016, and then all that that entailed, like kind of leading up to the pandemic in 2020. It's also obviously tracking your experiences in the rave scene, which begin in earnest as you start to date Andrew. So, am I on the right track? Is there anything I'm missing?
That's about it. Yeah, yeah. That's kind of it. The book follows, yeah, my early experiments with drugs, which were much more introspective and in these kind of like more spiritual modalities. And then I kind of moved into partying and found more meaning and belonging actually in those scenes. But and it was using drugs in a very different way. And yeah, all of that is in tandem with Trump's election, me starting to work as a reporter at the New Yorker, and covering a lot of the major news events of 2018, 2019, 2020. And so the breakdown refers not only to the breakdown of my relationship and my ex's own mental breakdown, but also just, I don't know, the national breakdown that happened during the pandemic and in the summer of 2020 when it felt like I don't know, a very distinct moment, certainly in my lifetime.
Yeah, that was the summer of George Floyd. That was the summer of all those protests. I mean, we've been through a lot as people. And I think I keep having this conversation. I keep saying, like, I don't think we've fully reckoned with it even now.
Yeah, I think part of the reason I wanted to write the book was just for myself. It was so quickly forgotten and sort of, I don't know, swept under the rug. Nobody wanted to remember it. There was something embarrassing about that summer in some ways. And how seriously we took it. Like, it was just kind of, it was like, let's just leave that. Nobody wants to think about it again. And I felt like I needed to, for myself, just write down what had happened kind of in chronological order, just to have it, just to sort of, if in the future it's relevant and one can see some trajectory that we might not even be aware of right now, it seemed important to have that.
Well, it's a book that serves to me as like another reminder that when it comes to writing about an era or something big, the best way in is almost always personal. Like, this is a very personal narrative, and yet it speaks to so many shared experiences and themes. And people in reviews have been referring to it as like an excellent book about the Trump era, even though it's this book about your experiences mostly in like personal relationships and in this rave culture. And I think there's also some part of me that enjoyed this kind of transgressive aspect of a New Yorker staff writer who's like part of this really like intense party scene, and not in her 20s. Like, you're like in your 30s, you're approaching 40, and you're like out all night and doing drugs. And I'm a New Yorker subscriber. I guess in my mind, I have it as this sort of like high-minded, sober kind of publication. Like, did sharing this information in this book, when you consider your sort of day job identity, did you have any hesitation?
Yeah, I had a lot of hesitation. I mean, the New Yorker is a sober, high-minded place.
Right.
It is. It's not, it's a place with a lot of decorum and a lot of, and it's actually one of the reasons it's really nice working there is it's a place with a very firm sense of its own propriety. And yeah, so, I waited years to write about any of this. They knew I had written Future Sex and they hired me, so they knew that was kind of who I was, but it was sort of like I felt like I had to kind of put that identity aside, and inhabit a New Yorker voice that wasn't, that could prove that I was like a serious reporter that could cover politics and And I think it helped that I've always had a very pragmatic view of writing, because I've probably written for like not every magazine, but so many different magazines, and I've just never been precious about needing to adopt the voice of Men's Health if I have to earn $500 or whatever. And that, and so with the New Yorker, it was a little bit, even though it has a reputation for being a writer's magazine, it definitely has an institutional voice that I tried to put myself inside of. And yeah, and then I think, yeah, 2021, I wrote when they wanted to do a series of web articles about New York City coming back from the pandemic. So I wrote an article about clubbing coming back. That was my first time sort of outing myself in that realm, but it was still very held back. And, I wrote about ketamine. I wrote about the dating website or app field, where I put in a little bit more of my personal life. But, those pieces were always on the web. I didn't really feel like they kind of, that they would get a lot of respect. That I would do better writing a more serious profile of somebody. I don't know, kind of like a more mainstream thing. But yeah, but in the end, I wrote this book because I kind of had to. It felt compulsive, and it was liberating for me to get to write in my own voice again, because weirdly, the pieces I'd written for N+1 as a young writer that were kind of in my own voice, even though I probably got paid like $900 total for 4 really long articles, I think they really helped. Like, I got to write in a voice that was just myself, and I really missed that feeling. And so with this book, I really wanted to go back. And when the question of excerpting it in the magazine came up, I had no expectation. I thought the magazine might turn it down. But, and it meant a lot to me that they decided to run a piece. It made me feel like, okay, these two halves of my personality get to be, I don't have to act, I don't have to hide one at my day job, maybe.
Well,
but I'm sure, I've seen critiques online, like, that say I shouldn't be taken seriously because of writing about drugs and partying, and a lot of stuff about my age, that, it's undignified to go out at my age, that kind of thing.
You mentioned earlier, when it comes to partying, and we've said it more than once, it was the rave scene. It's kind of a reemergent rave scene in New York in like the 2014 to 2020 era. Is that
probably 2010. I didn't really start going out till 2014, but Bossa Nova Civic Club, which was like one real central node, that opened in 2012. A lot of the parties I described started around 2012. So I think that's an important date, maybe.
And you mentioned that you found meaning in this party scene. I think, like, from the outside looking in, people are thinking of like all night raves where everybody's on drugs. Like, what would be the deep meaning that you find there or found there?
Yeah, I think it was a sense of finding an outside to mainstream culture and mainstream expectation about how one should live. If you take the summer of like Taylor Swift and Barbie and all of that, that stuff is so alienating to me. And if that was all there was like Barbie and Taylor Swift, I don't know, I would feel really alone in the world. And so I think when I say meaning is going out in these scenes, I just found people who were just experimenting with their style, with their bodies, with the music, in a way that was really anti-materialist at the time. And really, there's just like a lot of social mixing, people from different backgrounds. And it was really moving to me. I felt like I was finally having a first order New York experience after kind of hearing about these other eras. But in my time in New York, especially when I moved to New York in 2003, it felt like the city had been so just kind of gentrified and made so expensive that there wasn't a possibility for like an alternative subculture to really thrive there. And then I found this scene and this group of people. It just really, it was so creative and so, you know, defiant. It had a very defiant of, I don't know, just like brunch culture and Instagram, really. Like it was, you know, an anti-phone scene. You didn't bring your phone. It didn't translate onto your phone. It was very much about being in person with people. And that, you know, I've always felt so alienated by just like photography culture and self, I don't know, the advertisement of the self on these platforms. I resisted Instagram for a really long time, but I did join in 2021 to get on Raya. So now I'm on Instagram, but I
But
hate.
you've only posted like I just followed you. You've only
Yeah.
posted like 4 times, so let's not get
Yeah,
carried
I
away.
did. Yeah. I've never, and I follow like 30 people. I'm terrified of it, but yeah, I mean, I have been posting for the first time. I just downloaded the app actually yesterday for the first time. I was just using like the web browser, but because I wanted to be able to promo the book, but I fully intend to delete it once I'm through this promotion cycle.
Good for you. I mean, good for you. And like, you know, there are moments in the book where you're describing being at one of these all night parties, and like part of the like transgressive fun of it is that there will sometimes be like an all night party, and then the party will shift to a new venue or something, or it'll just end. And you and your friends or whoever will walk out of this party venue in the middle of like morning rush hour, or like Sunday morning, as like people are just waking up and like going on their like power walks or beginning to head out to brunch, and you're emerging from some underground party venue, and you're feeling like you've been or you've had access to an alternative to the mainstream. Like, I don't know, those descriptions were poignant for me, and I could see the appeal, you know, the fun of being like, yeah, I was in another world that
Yeah,
had.
it was really powerful, and I think everybody that was there, all my friends that lived that moment, we just kind of, you know, it was just kind of like a movie or something. I don't know. It was just, yeah, you had this sense that even even from your peers and people that had the same aesthetic sensibilities as you, they just kind of had no idea what you were doing. And it felt like a little bit of a secret moment where you had kind of like subverted the city. You had like found a kind of, yeah,
Like a
a part
portal.
of the city that nobody quite knew about, where you could kind of really be free and break some rules. And you know, the scene still exists now, but it's pretty different. It's much more kind of, it's just bigger, and it doesn't quite have that sense of intimacy that it had, where it would just kind of be the same few hundred people every weekend for a while.
You a good dancer?
No, I'm definitely not a good dancer, but you know, I think that was another thing, is just as a writer, you spend so much time alone sitting. It's like so physically stagnant. Um, you know, you could just be like a brain in a vat. You don't even need your body, and so it just felt good to do something that was about, like, you know, moving your body around a little bit. Like
So you're
I was so jealous of like William Finnegan, you know, for having this like surfing hobby, and everywhere he went as a reporter, he could go surf a wave and stuff. I mean, I still wish I had something like that, but um, yeah, I think it's good to have something that's not um, cerebral if you have a very cerebral line of work.
What was that surf book that he wrote? I read that book. It was great.
Barbarian Days.
Barbarian Days. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I wish I could surf. I wish I could dance. I think like as I was reading your book, I was like, I was feeling tired and old. I was like, oh my God, like you have a lot of like physical energy to be able to go out all night like this. And then I'm also trying to imagine myself like the passage where you're in that club in Berlin. What's it called again?
Bergheim.
Like, I don't know. Like if you put me in there, like it would be the funniest documentary ever made. If you just like tried to put me into a place like that and track my behavior, I wouldn't know what to do. I feel like I guess if I was on enough drugs, I might dance or something, but I am not a dancer.
It's a place where you kind of get swept up, and I think a lot of it too is just you know, I always emphasize this because people want to talk about like the scene and stuff, but at the heart of it was music that was really good. And I don't think that, music that intellectually engaged me. And I don't think if that was there, if I would have like, none of it would have been that interesting to me. I'd like been to Burning Man. I've been to Burning Man like 5 times. I've had fun at Burning Man, but like the music is terrible. And it didn't feel like a intellectually engaged. I mean, I did write about it. I was interested in it, but this for me, I felt like I was having experiences kind of equivalent to reading a great book or seeing a great movie. I felt like I was really having, getting to see people that, you know, manipulated music in such a way that they were really, creating very, yeah, special, unforgettable experiences.
And these are DJs. Like, what's some of the music that you really love from this scene? That like, is it stuff that's on Spotify, or did you have to be there?
So the DJs played. They're producers that make electronic music tracks, right? And then there are DJs that play those tracks and mix those tracks, right? So I'm not like the most erudite music person, honestly. So for me, I was mostly just experiencing it through the DJs mixing. And like they're playing in some cases really old music. Like there's a DJ I really love named Carlos Safran who is from Detroit but lives in San Francisco now. He's a cheesemonger. And he has a collection of acid techno music from many, I don't know, but most of it probably from a long time ago. That the music is just so cool and so weird. It was never, it was always made for small groups of people. And yeah, somebody like that is just like a savant at collecting these kind of like rare art ephemera from underground culture. And then there's people making music right now that, you know, I mean, I can just list people, but they wouldn't really mean anything.
Give me a couple.
Let me see who I really like, who's like new. So I just a couple weeks ago saw a DJ. I think he's British. Yeah, he's British, named I don't know if he goes by Drum or DJ Rum. He plays vinyl. He also produces his own tracks. And yeah, it was sort of, I saw him play like in the middle of the afternoon in New York a couple weeks ago, like on nothing but cold brew. And it was just, he had 3 turntables. He was just playing, like, it was just stuff that sounded so weird and so different. And so I'm bad at explaining it, but just, whatever the opposite of the most canned pop music you can think of, something that's like, in the book, I compare it to reading difficult poetry or experimental poetry, where you're freed from something that's trying to tell you what to think. And instead something that oftentimes might sound dissonant or even difficult, but that's interesting and layered and has an order of sense making that might be unexpected, either through repetition or through withholding or all kinds of strategies, slowing things down, speeding them up.
Yeah, I mean, it's not exactly the same, but it's reminiscent of like experiences that I had in my younger days at like Dead shows.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely, unfortunately, like, a lot of comparison to be made between that, because it's really durational listening. It's about repetition. It's about things being teased, and it's music that in some cases is meant to sound good on LSD, and the duration is a big part of an LSD trip. Um, you know, I think there's a lot of similarities, for better or worse, between jam band culture and and psychedelic techno. And and there's a way too in which it's a shared heritage of best practices about what to do when you're on drugs, and how to have like a kind of ecstatic experience. Like I think you can actually kind of draw a direct lineage. There was this party in Wisconsin, actually, I don't know if you ever heard of it, called Even Further. Is in the 1990s. It was this guy from Wisconsin, had started going to house music parties in Chicago and literally read the electric Kool-Aid acid test and wanted to bring the two things together. So he started throwing this rave in Wisconsin, in a farmyard, and he was the first person to bring Aphex Twin to the U.S. I think he was the first person to bring Daft Punk. Yeah, it's like it. These things all they definitely, there's a lineage there that you kind of um, that's really interesting. Yeah, just post-war psychedelic culture in America and how it's evolved.
Well, and I think too, like there's this feeling that you describe in the book coming out of one of these parties. You said earlier, like, there's, it's like the same couple hundred people you would see over and over again, at least for a time.
Yeah,
There's an enormous bond that I feel with especially the friends of my youth in college with whom
yeah,
I had psychedelic experiences. It's like this unbreakable. I joke, I compare it to like, we served in war together or something. Like it has that feel. Like you've been through a kind of a shared big experience, sometimes a shared trauma even, but it really bonds you. And then I think too of how after the fact, it's very difficult to describe, like not just the psychedelic experience, but like why it was so good.
yeah,
There's such a challenge involved in trying to relate to somebody. I mean, you do a very heroic job of it in this book, because I think somebody who's never experienced this scene, like me, like read it with great interest, and it was incredibly absorbing. But isn't it a challenge to try to come out of one of those experiences and break it down for somebody that has no frame of reference?
yeah. It's so ephemeral, and it immediately kind of dissipates. And you're like, what was I chasing? Why do I keep going back? What's the thing? And then when it happens again, it's almost like you're going on the memory of the thing rather than like a ability to fully conjure it. And then personally, I think I'm always working against too, like, oh, this is a waste of time. This is decadent. You're too old for this. And my friends and I talk about this a lot. Like, you know, were we, are we just doing something stupid? Do we devote ourselves to something kind of like dumb? Especially when I was first pitching this book or trying to sell this book, I I would tell people, oh, I'm kind of interested in writing about like the techno scene in Bushwick, and I would just see their brains kind of be like, like, yeah,
I think writing about psychedelic experiences is fraught, like at least on this, like at surface level. But I should say that as a reader, every time somebody does it and does it well, I love it. Like I've read
yeah.
all those
Well,
books. I feel like I like the Michael
me
Pollan,
too.
Tao Lin's book Trip. I mean, anything that somebody really invests time and energy in, to trying to kind of investigate and articulate that scene and those experiences, I'm always grateful for.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, a lot of my closest friends really came out of this, and I think every time we're back together and we have a really powerful experience with the music, we're just like reminded, yeah, there's that closeness between us. There's a sense of like, oh, we're so lucky to have something outside of Ticketmaster world and Netflix world that feels so yeah, personal. And when I see a DJ that has devoted their life to making these experiences for a very small group of people, and there's not money in it, it's not Electric Daisy Carnival or something, like it just, I guess I'm reminded what I want to do with my writing too. It's kind of like, oh, I want to have that standard of excellence that only a few people might might get. But for the people that get it, it means a lot to them. You know, that was kind of what I saw with the music. And yeah, I think you can't convince a lot. I mean, yeah, the thing I get all the time is like, oh, I can't stay up all night anymore, or I have kids now and stuff. But I think it's funny because my older Gen X friends that raved in the 90s and now their kids are old enough that they can leave them alone again. They just want to go back to party because they still have those feelings and those memories. I mean, if you look at the YouTube comments on like a house music track, it's amazing. It's like people are like, oh, that was the best night of my life, or you know, it's really, these are really powerful experiences for people, that they don't, yeah, even if their lives are super different now, they still value those times, I think.
I saw Fish at the Sphere. Like a friend of mine gave me a ticket and was like, "Come to Vegas." And I was like, "All right, I'll drive out there. I've got to take." I wanted to see the Sphere,
Yeah.
and I didn't like it.
Yeah. No,
Uh,
I went, yeah.
I don't know. I'm in the minority, but I was like, everyone's like the Sphere, the Sphere. I felt like I was like inside of a phone.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's nothing I hate more than a screen when I'm, there's nothing I hate more than a screen with a screensaver. I'm like, I look at a glowing rectangle all day. Like, I don't want anything to do with that. I don't want any computer graphics. Like, that to me is like the least psychedelic thing you can do. And the parties that I like are very committed to kind of like a minimalism that, you know, doesn't, yeah, put a screen in your face. But I had this, I went to Dead and Co just kind of out of curiosity, and I didn't really get, you know, the I, it was great, it sounded great, you know,
At the
the,
Sphere.
no, I went at the Forum in LA.
Oh, okay, yeah,
um and it was great, but yeah, you're just like, a beer is $20. It's just so uncool. It's so, and the security line and the just extortionate nature of every step of the process, from parking to needing to eat a pretzel to, you know, like, it felt just, I don't understand how you can have like, a, that wasn't what the Dead was, right, in its original incarnation, and I don't understand. It seems like you're only like prodding a memory of something in that experience. Like, I don't understand how you could have like a fully immersive psychedelic experience when Ticketmaster is kind of ruling your yeah, your entire experience of the thing.
yeah, yeah, no doubt. I feel the same way, and I feel like I often wonder, like, who the fuck can afford to go to these things?
I mean, boomers.
I mean, it's crazy. Like,
Yeah.
I was looking at tickets for like sports events. I'm a sports fan, you know, here in LA, and I'm looking at like, well, what's the secondary market? It's like $1,200 for a good seat at a sporting.
Yeah.
I'm like, who is paying for this? That's
Yeah,
for one ticket. So you're paying $3,000 to go to a game for
and
two people?
it's like they're taking your love of a thing that's kind of pure and manipulating it and extorting it. Just doesn't, turning it into this like completely transactional thing, and it just bums me out. Like, I love going to a baseball game, you know,
Yeah.
and a baseball game is relatively affordable, but
I mean, that is
um
like, I mean, it depends. I guess if you're sitting in the bleachers, but like if you're sitting behind home plate, even up, it's like $350 a ticket at Dodger Stadium. So
wow.
you're out for $700 for tickets before you've paid for parking, for like a $20 beer, you know, like
Right.
all that stuff. So it just, I don't know. I find it to be extortionate and ridiculous,
It
but
is, and yeah, you can't really, it's just kind of like the nature of America. It's
yeah,
like,
it's fucked.
if you can charge more, they will come, I guess.
Well, let's talk about, I mean, we have to talk about the relationship with Andrew in greater detail because it is so much a part of the book, especially in the book's latter, like what, half or more than half.
Hmm.
And I think Andrew is maybe emblematic in many ways of the personal impacts of like self-medication and like the darker sides of drug use and drug
Mm-hmm.
abuse, but also maybe like the larger, like more macro societal pressures and fissures and like breakdowns that like we were living through and you were living
Mm-hmm.
through during the times that you're describing in this book. And I'll read a quote from the book where you say Andrew took drugs to turn off parts of himself that threatened to destroy him. I took them to psychically rearrange a world I understood to be so deeply corrupted by moral hypocrisy and the profit motive that I sought a chemical window to see outside, also for pleasure, for fun. I think that's a very succinct description of two ways of doing drugs. The first of which is maybe not so healthy, especially over the long haul. And the second of which I think can be sustainable as long as a person is, exercises some like caution,
Yeah, I mean the drugs, you know, I mean a lot of people have already read the book as a despite my attempts to kind of prevent the criticism, read the book as a drug, a story of drug punishment that, we did a bunch of drugs and then everything fell apart and it was because of the drugs. And it's just tricky. Drugs are really tricky. They even the most benign ones, are the ones that are most socially accepted, like weed and alcohol. I mean, as is clear in the book, my ex's biggest addiction was weed, was cannabis, and I don't even know if addiction is the right word, but that was the substance that really got between us, and that I felt like kind of, yeah, was the one that I had the most difficulty with, at least. Uh, or sorry, I'm not really a cannabis user. So it was the one that I had the most anxiety around him using, because it was what he did every day versus, yeah, the drugs we took to go out to party, which we weren't doing them every day. It was the one that was the substance to help moderate daily life that was a real challenge for me to live with.
and partially because you weren't doing it. And then there's like an inaccessibility when somebody's on a drug and you're not on it. There's a separation that happens. And I can see how that could be stressful. And I should say too, just for people listening who have not had a chance to read the book yet, like you eventually come to an understanding of Andrew's drug use as a process, especially maybe with the weed, but I think with other stuff too, but a kind of method of self-medication to try to um, help like moderate or modulate the effects of like a deeper mental health challenge, which I think is bipolar disorder or
Yeah, I mean, he, in the process of fact checking the book excerpt for the New Yorker, did confirm to a fact checker that he was diagnosed with bipolar eventually. He never confirmed that to me. And yeah, so so yeah, I mean, I surmised as much, but didn't really want to, put that in the book with until he, yeah, and we kind of added that at the very end, that line that he was diagnosed with it. Yeah, and I do think he had a long history of trying to moderate his moods with cannabis. I think that's pretty common.
whereas you seem to have a healthier relationship with drugs. I mean, you're not somebody like you say, you're not a pot smoker, you're not much of a drinker. You like psychedelics, but like psychedelics are not drugs you can do every day. I mean, these are drugs you do very sporadically, typically.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm just lucky. There's something in me that just, after a big, change in consciousness, I just want to return to baseline and stay there for a while. I don't write on drugs. because I have to write every day. And if I can't treat it as some kind of state of emergency and take Adderall all the time. I'd just be on drugs all the time. So I believe in the discipline of the thing, even though it makes me miserable. It's, yeah, I somehow, there's something in me that just has a break that I put on. But I think it's just lucky. It's just like, it's not some extraordinary willpower that I have or something. Because when I see people that struggle to control their drug use, it's just, you can never tell why it goes in that direction. I think a lot of people it really does go back to some kind of trauma in their childhood, or, yeah, that they need to medicate, or yeah, I don't know, but I think, yeah, that's kind of, I don't do drugs every day. That's kind of my rule.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how you could, especially
Yeah,
past a certain point in life. Like,
yeah.
oh, like I was going to say, when I went to the Sphere to see Fish, one thing I did notice, because like I'm in the Wynn Hotel, you know how it's connected to the Sphere. I don't know if you've been. Have you been to the Sphere or no?
No.
Okay, so like the hotel where everybody sort of like decamps from is usually the Wynn, because there's an underground tunnel that you can take to the venue. You don't have to like walk out in the heat, basically.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember being in this like hotel bar at the Wynn, like before the show. And I only went to one show. I'm not doing like three of these things in a row. And like I am standing there at the bar, and there's a woman about my age, and I'm 49. So same generation. And I could just see this look on her face. And I could see the same look on a lot of people's faces, where they're like in their 50s, maybe even older, and trying to relive it, which is a very natural thing to want to relive. Like you said, it's a great experience, but this kind of look on their face, like, I went so big last night and I'm hurting so badly. It was kind of this like valiant warrior type thing, but it's like, yeah, you can't past a certain point just do it physically anymore.
Yeah, your body doesn't recover the same way. But that's, depends what you're taking. Like, that's definitely true with alcohol and some other drugs. But, the nice thing about a lot of psychedelics is they're kind of relatively physically non-toxic. So LSD and mushrooms, they're not, I don't know, they're very powerful psychologically, but they don't really, take a toll physically, like a really bad one.
The same way that like alcohol would.
Alcohol or MDMA or speed or coke, yeah, those kind of leave.
They leave a mark.
They leave your mark, yeah.
So I want to also touch upon a narrative thread in this book that bears mentioning, because it's part of, I think, the heart of the book. And it's this kind of inner struggle that you describe related to being a woman in the world, professionally, interpersonally, dealing with, as you described in that ayahuasca trip at sort of the beginning of your journey, what did you call it? The women's magazine voice.
Mm-hmm.
That's sort of like barking out orders and instructions and criticisms. I think a lot of women can probably relate.
Yeah.
And sort of grappling with what you want out of life. And, you're about to turn 40, and it's like, do I want to have a family? Do I want to live this traditional existence? No, I don't. And yet I think I might. And, you're sort of going back and forth internally about that. And there's a passage where you say, a middle-aged solitude I had always been scared of was happening. And I saw the loneliness of the years ahead, and it terrified me. I was wrong about a lot of things at that time, but I was right to be scared about that. Like, that's a very bracing and honest assessment. And I just love to hear you like talk about that, and now being on the other side of it, like how you feel about that sentiment.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of women, especially, see 40, we're socialized to see 40 as this expiration date, when it becomes more difficult to have babies after, apparently, your looks, you're told you're no longer sexually desirable. And that if you don't shack up or some kind of established something by that age that on the other side of it, there's just nothing. It's kind of loneliness and unhappiness. And I think even the most kind of self-possessed women especially live in fear of that. And there is, and I think, I guess my point with the book is my fear of that caused me to make a lot of really bad decisions. It caused me to stay in a relationship that absolutely was not good for me to be in. And that was the bad drug, this idea that convention would be the thing that would offer safety and protection, and that without it you're miserable. The kind of like JD Vance portrayal of childlessness and single life. I think that's why it touched people made them so angry, because it's, you might have that life. It might not have been something that you chose, and it might have just happened that way, or the other thing might have just been so elusive. And yeah, the first couple of years after the breakup, I was so, I don't know, I was just like totally heartbroken, that I had crossed that threshold. And then, as happens, it turns out like life is good. And life in your 40s, especially, like I'm lucky enough to have a job I love, to have a lot of friends, to have this music scene, and all the friends that I've had there for years, so that I can go out and just immediately kind of feel a sense of belonging and see people I know. Like, life is really pleasurable, and it's just kind of, now I'm like, I'm just, not that I encourage everybody to break up, but with their partners, things are bad, but, like to stay in something bad because of that fear and that idea, it's just not a way to live. And I'm really, happy with how my life turned out. I don't know. It's hard to imagine it being better in some ways. So
yeah, it's like, that makes sense.
yeah.
You get to that moment of like, it's like that moment of fear, and a lot of that fear has been instilled, been sort of like enculturated to like expect, like you said, there's like a void on the other side of it. And so then you kind of go past the tipping point, and there's this period of depression, and you're like, okay, so I'm in the void. And then at some point you realize like the void's not so bad. And like, there's not even really a void. You know what I'm saying? Like life just goes on.
Yeah. And it's good. Yeah. And I do. And I didn't, yeah, I mean, and I've kept going out. I mean, not the way that I used to, but I have a group of friends that I meet up with at things a couple times a year. And I also go out a lot when I'm in New York. And I feel really lucky to have that, to have, I mean, I've been talking a lot on tour about the loneliness epidemic, and like, it really helps to finish a piece of writing on a Wednesday night and be like, oh, I can just go to this place and listen to music, and all my friends will be there, or I'll know a few people there, or I won't know anybody, but we share this thing in common, and we can have, I can have a little bit of a social experience and then go to bed and not feel like sad and alone.
What's that book, Bowling Alone?
Yeah,
a book
exactly.
called like Raving Alone. That's maybe even sadder than Bowling Alone.
Yeah, raving alone, but together. Yeah.
Well, I really enjoyed this book, and it's just such a page turner.
Oh,
And
that's great
yet
to
also
hear.
I feel like is a book that speaks to like larger experiences and themes in a really deft way. And, because so much of the narrative is framed around the Trump years, like, I mean, we're a month out as of tomorrow, like when
Hmm.
we're talking from election 2024, I guess I'm kind of curious to know how you're feeling about all of it.
I mean, I've been on the campaign trail actually for the New Yorker, and as soon as this promotion phase is done, I'm going back. So I've been to a lot of Kamala Harris rallies. I haven't been to any Trump things. Somebody else is covering that, but I'm pretty worried. I don't feel that confident that the Democrats are going to win this. I feel very upset about the wars in Gaza and now in Lebanon, and I don't. I think the party is hoping. The Democratic Party is kind of hoping it can just like coast on good vibes and Oprah, and I don't. I don't know. Just don't know
Like
how that's going to
the
play
vibes
out.
that you're gathering on the ground at like rallies, like I mean, I see how it appears on TV. Like, is there stuff that you've learned in person that people might not see on TV that you could point to?
Well, so I've been off for a couple weeks. So initially, in July and August, everybody was just so ebullient that it wasn't that we weren't just kind of like in this funeral march toward defeat. And at the convention, it was just like balloons and happiness and all of this stuff. But I think that's kind of worn off. So I don't know. I'll see how it is when I'm back out there, what people are saying. It's also, I've tended to just cover rallies, and those tend to be the most enthusiastic people. So, but I think the next story I'm doing is going to be more in a swing county, talking to all kinds of people. So, um,
Do you have a sense of what's going to happen?
I have no idea. No. What do you think?
I mean, I think she's going to win, and I think
You
she's going to.
do?
I don't think it's going to be particularly close, but like that also might be self-protective because I'm terrified of a second Trump term. I think it would be a catastrophe.
I just don't know. Yeah, I'm really scared of that too. I mean, it's like I get emails from the Trump campaign, and it's not even couched in any kind of euphemism. It's like we're going to fire everybody in the Department of Education and clear it of Marxists and other people. You know who you are. And, that doesn't sound like a democracy. Um, yeah, it's not just alarmism. I think to be genuinely scared of what's ahead if there's another Trump presidency, especially, for women, for queer people, for immigrants. Um, it's just not for, yeah, the plants and animals of the natural world. It's not going to be, um, it's really hard to know. We, the first one, we seem to kind of have gotten through it without major changes to society, but I don't know. And then it's hard that the Democrats kind of aren't upholding their own purported ideals um, in certain situations right now. It makes it difficult to wholeheartedly believe that they're the better alternative.
Or at least to get like fully excited, like
Yeah.
fully like enthused. I feel that, and like I just hope we can get past this, and then what I tell myself is like, let's just get through this. Let's make sure he's not given the nuclear codes again, and then let's sort it out after that. But I don't know if that's
Yeah,
the.
we'll see. I mean, I definitely wrote the book from a place of thinking he was going to win. I mean, I finished the book before the change in candidate.
Oh, right. You were finishing this in June.
Yeah, so yeah, I definitely, um, I wanted to write down, I don't know, like hope that maybe the book would be read sometime in the future as some, could offer some sense of how whatever happens later. Yeah, because
A breakdown.
yeah, and like because I was influenced in the book too by books about the 1930s and also about the AIDS crisis that are very much like set in their time and without being able to see outside of it, and now we can read them and they indicate a certain future.
Well, speaking of the future, I know you're just celebrating the publication of this book, but do you have any other book projects in the works or a vision of one like percolating?
I really wish I did. I have no idea. I would kind of like to do a very like classic nonfiction, third person narrative, like propulsive narrative nonfiction, but I don't know that I'm that kind of writer, but I don't have any ideas. I'm like, yeah, we'll see.
You're very good. You're very good at writing personal narrative.
Yeah, but yeah, there's nothing really new in my life right now, so we'll see what the next couple of years hold and what I feel drawn to.
Well, it's a pleasure to meet you. I love the book. Congratulations, and best wishes to you on tour and with whatever comes next.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me on the show. I'm a big fan.